And even as I was doing that, I wasn't really focusing on the content marketing side of things, and found that the cold outbound yielded, I think, 0 actual conversions, but just the kind of very organic content that I was creating actually generated a few leads that turned into customers. And so without doing any work, it seemed like the content side was much more valuable.
Welcome, everyone, to the third episode of the Zero to Community podcast, where we showcase the stories of founders and marketers who have built their own communities around their company's products or services from scratch. And for our third episode, we have Chris, who's the founder and CEO of Meander, which is an AI-powered talent acquisition service. For the audience, Chris, can you tell us about yourself and about Meander?
Sure, yeah. So, hi everyone. I am building a platform that helps with recruiting using AI and process improvement, really to identify some of the challenges that I faced in my last role. Before starting this company in 2021, I was a senior leader in the recruiting organization at Wayfair. We recruited thousands of people, and I got to see some of the challenges at scale and felt like a lot of it could be done more effectively. Previously in my career, I'd worked in supply chain, and earlier in my career in aerospace engineering, where I worked on some of the implementation of unmanned systems and unmanned aircraft, and saw some of the challenges in terms of regulation and technical work there, and felt like the TA and HR space is kind of ripe for innovation right now. And I'm pretty excited to be working in this space and actually building kind of products that I think solve some of the big challenges that I think really exist out there.
Awesome. Now, can you tell us who uses Meander? Who's the persona for talent acquisition as a service?
Yeah, so it's changed quite a bit, I think, over the journey. I think initially I was working with TA leaders who were looking for ways to optimize their recruiting process and actually get more productivity out of each individual recruiter. And so we looked at kind of ways to optimize top of funnel recruiting. I think what we found more recently is outreach from earlier stage founders that are trying to do a lot of the recruiting process themselves because they either don't have the budget or the time or really the kind of interest to hire a big recruiting team, and maybe they've worked with agencies that haven't really helped solve their recruiting challenges. So what we're really trying to do now is empower individuals on the business side to run their own recruiting process. And so generally that's founders or exec level people at early stage companies before they have that ability to build their own in-house HR and TA team.
Absolutely. Well, those seem like two fairly different segments. So, can you tell us how you went about looking at those two segments and shifting from the first to the second?
Yeah, I'd say the journey has been a lot of like test and evaluation. So, I initially started with this hypothesis that the person that would want to buy this kind of product would be the people that I was working very closely with, these kind of heads of talent acquisition who were running large teams of recruiters. We had over 400 recruiters on the team, and my job was to help optimize the whole recruiting process. I also had a 30-person recruiting team of my own that I was managing and looking at ways to improve. And so the initial hypothesis was that this kind of tool that I was building would add a lot of value to those individuals. And so a lot of the initial outreach and engagement and experimentation was really focused there. What I actually found is as we were running those experiments was getting some kind of market pull and demand from others who saw what I was doing and actually got it very quickly without me really kind of communicating that value prop to them, and kind of asked me to help out with some of the processes. And so that kind of shifted a little bit. I was still in the pre-product market fit phase. And so I felt that having that demand pull from the market in a different direction was a good signal that maybe there was more opportunity in a different area, but also kind of that tied in with the changing external market dynamics where we had a slowdown in hiring within the tech industry, which is where I was focused. And so all of a sudden, large tech was not hiring in volume, which is what my initial product was designed to optimize for, but it was more about hiring the right people and making sure that the interview process was filtering out those that would be a poor fit. And so I think the strategy of the business and the product roadmap changed as we learned more about who was actually asking for the product that we were building, and then how could we adapt what we had already done in order to serve those customers. So it's very much a kind of like lean startup, test, measure, improve, evaluate, pivot, persevere kind of approach.
That's amazing. It's great. I think I've only felt that kind of market pull once in my own company. And my God, it's fantastic when you do kind of feel that. And I guess for the context of the audience that we have today, I think what they might be especially interested in is the content part of this. So I know that you make content. Can you tell us about the kind of content that you put out and why you got started with content?
Yeah, so I guess right now there's kind of four main channels of content marketing I do. The main one is kind of LinkedIn, starting to grow in YouTube with a YouTube channel we run, and then I also do email marketing and have a blog that I kind of post different content up to. I'd say the email marketing and the blog are probably less front and center just based on the experimentation that I've done. LinkedIn and YouTube seems to gather a lot more engagement, actually lead to a lot more potential leads that will hopefully turn into customers at some point in the pipeline.
Okay. And then how did you get started with what was the original motivation for getting started? Was that something you started from day one? And then like what was the initial target? Were you building content for people specifically in talent acquisition, or was this already when you were looking at say founders?
Yeah, I'd say going into starting this company, I had no real experience with marketing and I didn't quite appreciate the power of marketing. And so I went in with the traditional kind of MBA entrepreneurship path where you interview a bunch of customers, you build products for those customers, and you get them to buy it. And then you kind of like iterate over that approach. And as I was going through that process, I got some really good feedback. I got a lot of kind of warm connections on the phone. And when I was asking for ideas and customer interviews, I found that a lot of people were willing to give their time, but they actually weren't necessarily converting into customers unless it was someone that I already knew closely and knew had the kind of problem that I was solving. But what I found was interesting is I posted a little bit about the product that I was building on LinkedIn in the early days of the launch, and actually got a lot of interest from people that even outside of my network, just kind of reaching out organically through emails and asking me a little bit more about what I was building and whether they could participate in any kind of pilot or upcoming trial, which led me to believe that this was a channel that I had completely overlooked. And then as I was getting close to the launch process, I kind of started the more traditional like cold outbound email campaign, signed up for a CRM and an automation service, looked at best practices, read a bunch of books, and then tried to figure out how do I find cold leads, get the message out to them, and then potentially convert them. And I ran an experiment for several months to see what the kind of conversion rate was going to be like on that cold outbound. And even as I was doing that, I wasn't really focusing on the content marketing side of things and found that the cold outbound yielded, I think, zero actual conversions, but just the kind of very organic content that I was creating actually generated a few leads that turned into customers. And so without doing any work, it seemed like the content side was much more valuable. And so we initially were planning to launch in the summer of 2022. But as we decided to put that launch on hold, given the market changes and rethink the type of product that we needed to build, I then started to invest more in content marketing to try and understand a little bit more about what is actually going on in the market, what are people interested in, what are they asking questions about, and started to then use content as a way to test hypotheses in the market. But instead of reaching out to maybe 100 people or get warm introductions to 100 people to get 30 customer interviews, I could post an idea and a hypothesis, and that would get in front of thousands of people. And those that were actually interested would comment or like or potentially reach out to me privately, which is what happened a lot. And so all of a sudden, I found this incredibly valuable channel to get feedback instantaneously without having to set up multiple phone calls. You can then jump on a call with someone to learn a little bit more about the comment that they asked, but it's a warm introduction then. And so the actual information that you get is much richer, I found, than the kind of one-on-one conversations I was having with someone who actually turned out not to be willing to purchase the product that we were kind of scoping. And so that was how kind of initially got into the content side. And so that was when I started on this path of learning more about it, started to focus on how do I build an audience? How do I engage with more people? How do I define my ICP so that I can actually target the people and write content for the people that are most relevant to the business that I'm building? And that kind of just snowballed from there, really. And for the last 2 years, I've been kind of experimenting as with the product, testing and iterating to figure out what messages resonate. And generally I found to be a good leading indicator of where I should take the product roadmap. So it's become kind of fully integrated, especially as a solo founder now, where I develop the product and I write the content and they kind of go hand in hand together.
That's amazing, and that's almost similar to how I imagine as I roll out my own product, doing that both pieces in tandem. And I think I'm trying to put my mind in, put myself in the shoes of like a founder who might just be starting, right? And I think you're looking at potentially different channels for growing your own product, right? So you actually
Mhm.
tried and did a whole round of outbound and saw that the numbers did like the strategy, the return on investment didn't seem as high as the content marketing piece. Just for context, would you be able to share like, specifically, like just high level, the numbers of outbounds that you tried? How did you kind of source leads, and what was the, I don't know, like conversion between like you sending something and people actually responding? I know you actually mentioned you got zero actual customers, so we got
Mhm.
that bit, but like just an idea of like comparison that led to kind of deciding that the ROI wasn't nearly as high as content marketing.
Sure, yeah. So it's been a while, so the numbers maybe a little rusty on the numbers, but look, a couple of different approaches I tried. So one was the kind of a cold outbound approach that you would have an SDR do, I think at a larger company, where you kind of put a templated email, you personalize it a little bit, and you just send it out to as many people as possible. And I found that actually pretty much got zero responses. The response rate from that was, I think, less than 1%. And actually, many of those responses were, please remove me from your mailing list. Why did you get my email? So it wasn't really, it was kind of more of a spam based approach, which looking back at my own experience as a buyer in a previous role, there was no way I would have responded positively to that kind of outreach either. The other approach I tried, which was a little more successful, was following a framework written, I forget the author's name, but there's a book called the Mum Test. And essentially, the idea behind that is that you're not trying to kind of pitch a product. You're not trying to kind of get feedback in a way that puts someone in a situation where they're going to give you false signals essentially. And so it's more about learning how someone does something and the frustrations they find as they're doing that task. And so when you reach out to people, it's not reaching out to try and sell a product, even indirectly, it's reaching out to learn and gather information. I actually found the response rate for that was much better. I think I got of the outreach that I sent, which was more personalized, so it was more of a manual approach, probably a 10 or 15% response rate, almost all of whom then actually followed up with a call in the interview. And many of them prefaced the interview by saying, look, I don't have budget for this right now. I do recognize this is a problem and I want to give you feedback and kind of tell you a little bit more about how I do things. And so that was helpful. But again, when you think about the big picture of how do you get information on a problem that people are willing to pay for, actually learning that people are not necessarily willing to pay for that solution right now was incredibly helpful. Whereas on the content side, I could actually look at the number of impressions or the number of engagements on my content to the number of in-mails that actually led to phone calls that converted to customers. And although the numbers were much smaller there, the quality of those of each stage of that process was much higher. And so I found I was learning a lot more even from just the engagements and the interactions I was having on social media.
Okay. And then, so at some point, after you saw that content seemed to be working, and especially in terms of being a more promising channel for generating leads, you started putting more effort and thought to driving that as a growth channel. What was the process like from turning the, hey, these, what was the process like from going from, hey, these LinkedIn posts seem to organically be generating leads to like, I'm going to make this like a core growth strategy? Like, how did you learn to do content marketing essentially and put
Mhm.
structure around what was originally a pretty organic process?
Yeah, so one of the things I found just in engaging more on LinkedIn and spending more time there was a number of content creators who specialize in creating content about creating content. So it's kind of like an interesting approach. And I read a few different ideas and posts around structures of content creation. I came across Justin Welsh, who's one of I think, the big names in the space, learned a little bit about his approach. It seemed to resonate well with me. And so I signed up for his course and then kind of learned how to add like a structure and a framework around content creation. And as an engineer, I love systems, and I felt like if I could create a system that was easy to follow and that I could then use to write original content that I could then post and would resonate online, then I felt like there would be a good structure. It kind of that also aligned with a meeting I had with one of my advisors who, as I was talking through some of the challenges of building the business, said to me, well, you're not really a marketing person. And so maybe you should think about bringing on a marketing person to kind of help you figure out branding and messaging and engagement. And I looked at the time and thought, well, yeah, that's totally true. I don't really have a big online presence. I looked at the follow account on LinkedIn. It was kind of 1,500, I think, at the time. And most of that were direct connections that I'd made throughout my career thus far. And so I decided to invest a little bit of time and money in learning how to do it effectively and kind of built the framework, experimented with that a little bit. And all of a sudden, my content engagement took off. I had a framework that was not only allowing me to engage with potential customers, but also to learn as I went. So, kind of the process involved actually having a hypothesis each week, learning about that hypothesis, and then kind of creating a content plan based around that approach with a point of view that I would then take and then kind of use a hypothesis of how I saw the world as that point of view and then push that point of view out there to see if it resonated or if people pushed back or it didn't resonate at all and got no engagement. And that would then allow me to, in this experimentation style approach, actually run these tests on a weekly basis to refine the product roadmap a little bit more.
That's awesome. Well, I think one thing that I noticed that you seem to mention and be doing very well is taking a very structured kind of analytic approach, which as an engineer I certainly appreciate. But and I also think that for some founders who may be looking at doing content, right, it's not necessarily they may not approach this problem necessarily in a very structured and analytic way. So I guess maybe this is something that I think other folks could learn from. Like, could you at least at a high level describe the structure or the process rather for describing content? And I know you mentioned you look at analytics and you also have planning. Like in a very high level, could you describe the process from ideation all the way to measurement?
Sure. Yeah. And so it kind of starts off with the same way that you start off on the product development side of develop your persona, your ICP, and you try and understand what do they care about, what are their fears, whether they get their content. And actually all of mine was on LinkedIn, which is why LinkedIn seemed to be the channel for me. So once you understand that persona, then that becomes a good baseline for thinking, well, what do they care about? What is interesting? And so the kind of process I took was one of research and learn, and then apply those kind of ideas to the framework of the kind of challenges that TA leaders or more recently founders are facing as they think through recruiting problems. And so that kind of hypothesis then became kind of like a research paper. And so I would actually dedicate 30 to 45 minutes a day generally approaching this kind of content creation structure. And I'd always keep a list of different topics that interested me. So day one, I would research a topic, I would kind of copy and paste, I would add references. And so it's kind of like doing a book report almost of the latest one I did was how is AI going to impact HR and will HR exist in 5 years if AI continues to automate much of those processes? So I just wanted to get like a perspective of what are people saying right now? What are some of the kind of leading thoughts? And then how can I interpret that into kind of an executive summary so that if I was that persona and I wanted to learn about that very quickly, what are the kind of few paragraphs or key data points that I would need to know in order to understand that better? And so I would have that as my initial framework. The next day, I then start to think about, okay, what is the long form content that then communicates that in a way that is meaningful to this target audience? And so I initially started off mostly writing blog posts. I kind of got minimal engagement on those. So now I started to actually turn that content into more of a YouTube script. And so I would develop either slides or more often a spreadsheet template. So I'd use Google Sheets and actually structure the kind of work I was doing in a way that is hopefully easy to understand and easy to kind of copy and paste to a use case that someone's going through. And then kind of have a YouTube script around that to help people understand how to incorporate those kind of ideas. And then with that, so that's kind of stage two. Stage three is then to take all the ideas from that YouTube script and think about different ways to message them in short form content that's suitable for LinkedIn. So Justin Welsh has this interesting framework where each day you have a different style of content, like some is actionable, some is motivational, where it's more of like a personal story, some is very much analytical, where you're actually going deep on the topic. And I actually enjoy producing charts and sharing data behind different things. And so I would generally like write 5 pieces of short form content in 5 different styles that communicate the same idea, but in different ways that might resonate with different people. And then kind of from there, go back, take some of that content, incorporate that into the YouTube script, because each stage you're kind of learning a little bit more and refining the approach. Then the YouTube script becomes finalized, record a video. Then the last day, day 5, is generally publishing everything. I've been automating the publishing using a platform called Buffer. So that's pretty helpful for LinkedIn automation. And then kind of publishing on YouTube, try and do 1 video a week. We don't keep up to date with that as much as I should do, but that's the kind of like content creation side of things. But then to actually learn from that content, because it's one thing to push the content out there, but with it being an iterative process, what I then like to do is every morning spend half an hour and I will go into my content and then I have a list of 5 to 7 other content creators that I feel like write valuable content. So I then go and see what they're writing about, what they care about. Sometimes I'll get an idea from that and I'll put it in my idea spreadsheet. Other times I just want to engage and share my point of view. Again, it's like a way to test the way I see the world with the way other people see the world and kind of get feedback from that. And so that then creates this like circle of community where they see I'm writing my ideas against their content. They'll then kind of communicate back and look at my content and share their ideas. And so it's kind of like a reciprocity there. And so that's kind of like the day to day and the week to week. module, and then probably once a quarter, I'll then kind of look at all of the content I wrote from the previous quarter and I'll actually pull in all the metrics. And so right now, I think LinkedIn has a very good analytical framework. So I have to like manually go in, find the number of impressions, the number of engagements. So like how many likes I got, how many comments I got, and I'll track all of that in a separate spreadsheet, write any notes. So if some of the content really resonates well, I'll kind of write a note to like revisit. If it doesn't resonate, I'll write a note. If there's a lot of negative comments, then write a note just to remind myself to address the topic a little differently or not address the topic again in the future. And so with that kind of quarterly view of looking back at the content, I can then kind of come up with ideas of which content needs to be dug into a little bit more, where can I expand upon, and then how does that fit into the product roadmap, more importantly. Like if more people care about recruiting, capacity planning has been like one example of that, which is something I never thought would really resonate, but there's still a little content about how to build recruiting teams to meet headcount goals that actually that's become very valuable. And so I'm creating more of that kind of content, created a course that people can now take. And so it's kind of like all iterating back into this kind of framework of pushing stuff out there, learning what resonates, and then kind of using that to refine the roadmap a little bit more, and then updating the product roadmap in order to meet the needs of the target customers. And so it's kind of a bit of a monologue, but that's the full end-to-end process. And I keep spreadsheets for each things. I'll kind of stack rank different things, and I'm actually using ChatGPT a lot more now to copy content and ask for it to come up with new ideas around how the content can be presented, or kind of come up with themes. I'll give it a summary of the top 10 pieces of content and try and group those pieces of content into types of themes that then become topics for future research to kind of iterate off.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I did actually take a look at the framework that you mentioned. Thanks for sending those resources the last time we talked. And if you don't mind, I'll share some of those resources, like Justin Welsh and the content framework. Somehow, although it's fairly easy to kind of look at and understand, seeing someone in the real world implementing it is somehow a lot more helpful than just a high level framework on like a diagram. So hopefully that you actually implementing it in the real world might actually be a more useful example for people who might be interested in taking that kind of approach. I think I want to jump into maybe like two specific questions to follow up. So one is, you mentioned that quarterly you kind of look at the metrics and have that make a kind of you understand where to go from there. So one sec. Okay. So you mentioned you look at the metrics quarterly and then you evaluate what to change. Can you give us an example of something that concretely changed in the content marketing strategy itself after looking at the metrics?
Sure. So it was actually, I think one of the more recent changes that I made was in the types of content I produce for LinkedIn versus YouTube. What I found is that, so there's kind of two main areas that I focus on the content side. One is the kind of operational aspects of recruiting, like how do you recruit in the most efficient way possible, make sure your quality is as good as you can get with the resources that you have. And that resonates very well on LinkedIn, not necessarily so much on YouTube. The other type of content that I've been excited about is the application of AI in HR applications overall. So it's not just recruiting, but in across the board, like employee lifecycle management. That content seems to fall flat on LinkedIn, but gets a lot of engagement on YouTube, especially when I focus on the job market. There have been a couple of videos that I've created that have gotten a lot of engagement because they're focused specifically on things like how does the resume parser work when you give your resume to a job application, and they kind of pass that out and actually use that to make recommendations on whether to hire someone or at least screen someone. Kind of went behind the scenes on like, how does that work? And that content seems to do really well on YouTube. But if I try and communicate that on LinkedIn, I think given the format style, it doesn't seem to kind of resonate well. And so what I've done with that information now is start to kind of like diverge a little bit. And I'm actually alternating the type of content that I produce on. One week it will be more like recruiting ops focused. The next week it'll be more AI focused. And so they're kind of like interspersed, but I then know that AI content is not going to engage well on LinkedIn, but at least I can have that kind of cross-posting capability where I'll send people from YouTube to my LinkedIn channel and vice versa, so that I can hopefully kind of get some kind of overlapping Venn diagram where I find people that are interested in improving the recruiting process, using different approaches, different processes, but also have an interest in AI and the application in HR. And this is really the product roadmap that we have, is how can you implement AI in order to improve all of your HR processes. And so if I can kind of get that Venn diagram to overlap, it may be a sliver of people, but those people are going to be the most engaged and most likely to want to purchase any future product that we launch.
That's interesting. Well, I think this is maybe only one example that you have that you mentioned about this, but in terms of the differences between platforms, what do you think it is that, say, AI content performs better on YouTube? Is it the nature of how people are discovering content? Is it the nature of the social media algorithms and recommendation algorithms themselves?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is hard to do on LinkedIn is to communicate a complex idea. You generally have like two lines of text. It's kind of like a tweet to actually just get someone to engage further and click the read more part of the post. And so you can't really go into depth until someone clicks read more. So it's got to be almost kind of clickbaity to get someone to engage. And then I think that my hypothesis is that the clickbaity type content, then to go from here's one thing that recruiters hate to then actually going into detail about how to incorporate supply chain approaches to improve your recruiting process it's kind of like quite jarring and doesn't really flow as well. Whereas on YouTube, you could create a piece and say, here's a template for how you can map your recruiting process to improve your outcomes. And you actually give the template and you do a video walkthrough and kind of go into depth on how to think about the different parts of it. That content seems to do really well because you can actually see how it's being used. It's almost like a training session rather than, I think, with LinkedIn, the vast majority of people are scrolling on their phones and they just want like a quick hit or quick ideas. And so it's kind of like a very different style in terms of what you can communicate. And so I think the AI content on LinkedIn is probably got to be a little bit more contrarian in that you're saying something that many people don't believe. But that can also lead to negatives if you're doing this in a B2B context where you actually want the people that are going to be impacted by AI changes to HR to engage with you in a positive way. But you can't necessarily do that by saying AI is going to replace all of HR in the next 2 years. Even though that would be an interesting post, it's probably not going to lead to the outcomes that you want as a kind of a B2B content team.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I guess given the audience who might just be starting out, I think what they might be interested in learning about are kind of more the not just what worked, but also what didn't, right? Because people will probably make mistakes as they get started. Were there any kind of mistakes that you made early on, or maybe even regrets that you have from when you started making content?
Yeah, I'd say the mistake I made early on was not producing it from the start. The YouTube channel was kind of an afterthought, and it was only because I found that I couldn't actually communicate some of the ideas I wanted to get across on LinkedIn without walking through a video. And so I produced a couple of videos on this kind of like recruiting ops approach, and it was only kind of like a year later that I realized that those videos were now like SEO ranked as 1, 2, and 3 when you search for a certain search term that our ICP would likely be searching for. And had I known the value of that and the kind of long-term investment potential of creating good content early on, I would have started immediately with those two channels. But it was only by testing and experimenting that I realized that could be done. I'd say the second one is on LinkedIn. I tried to create some content that was a little more personal. And I think the challenge with short form media is you kind of have to summarize the headline content and you have to make it enticing. And there were a couple of posts that I made that just completely missed the mark. I didn't land in the way that I was kind of hoping it to be kind of motivational, and it sounded more like an egotistical post or something like that, which I think was a good reminder for me that I should kind of proofread everything, but also put myself in the shoes of everyone who's going to potentially read the content, not just the ICP, because there could be some, I think, negative implementations of writing the wrong style of content or kind of drifting too far off message. And it's kind of tricky because LinkedIn is a professional platform where you're representing yourself generally for writing content. And so everything you publish is going to be readable by everyone, especially those within your network. I think the lesson I learned from that as well is that short form social media is quite ephemeral in that you can post something and then the next day you post something else. And so one of the big learnings early on was to not get so hooked up on making every single piece of content perfect, because the next day you're just going to post something. And if you're posting every day over a year, you've got over 300 pieces of content. If only 10% of those resonate, then you've still got 30 pieces of high quality content that's probably led to some really good engagement. That's been a really strong kind of approach. I'd say the YouTube quality content is probably a little more important, but even then, some of the content that has taken the most time to produce has yielded the lowest engagement. And one prime example of that is you asked about my shift towards more deep dives and analysis as opposed to interviewing professionals in the space. And I found that when I started off and interviewed a lot of people who I looked up to and had a lot of really interesting things to say, the engagement on those kind of videos was much lower than those where I just threw up a spreadsheet and said, this is how you do this kind of approach. And I think it was because of the types of content that people are searching for. And I think it'd be very different. Perhaps a podcast approach would be slightly different, but I've never tested that implementation, just given the amount of time it takes to actually schedule individuals to talk on a podcast. As I'm sure you're aware, is a little more complex.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess reflecting on my own journey, I'm just starting out. Though I think one thing we have in common, just for context for people who don't, Chris and I we met when we were doing our MBA at MIT. And I think MIT was interesting in that there was especially an interesting focus on the intersection of business and kind of engineering. I think we both have an engineering background. So that's something I'm thinking about as well. I think that's resonating is that analytics piece of what's working and what's not. And I think where it intersects with business is not just, you have to kind of combine both like high level numbers as well as kind of thinking about personas, what your audience is thinking about. But I think you seem to be doing a fairly good job. So something to aspire to as I go through my journey with making content, and hopefully others as well. If they're listening, presumably they're thinking about making their own kind of content for their company. I guess on that, do you have any other thoughts or recommendations for someone who might be thinking about right now making content as part of their content marketing strategy for their company?
Yeah, I would say that if I was starting this all over again, I would define my persona first. And then the kind of next thing I would do is say, okay, what are they searching for? If they go on Google, what questions are they asking? And there's a lot of tools that actually help you to kind of dive into that in a little more detail. You can learn from that content, but also figure out where are the unanswered questions and where can you add value. And I think the journey for me has been more about where can I share what I know or uncover new information and make the lives of that persona, that target customer, easier so that I can build more credibility and kind of help people. It's more about helping rather than selling, content marketing side of things.
Absolutely. All right. Wonderful. Well, I guess maybe to wrap up, if someone wants to reach out to you or learn more about Meander, how can they do that?
Yeah, so kind of content side is you can find me on LinkedIn, Chris Mannion, should be fairly easy to find, or Chris Mannion. Meander is probably the easiest way to find me. The YouTube channel, I'm creating content there. The channel is at Recruiting Analytics. If you go onto YouTube, hopefully you'll find some of the content there helpful, or just meander.com. So meanderhq.com is our website. It's kind of going through a bit of an iteration right now, so it'll probably be very different in a few weeks' time, but that's probably the best place to learn more about what I do. But I'm on LinkedIn every day. That's a kind of core part of the business now. So yeah, I hope to kind of engage with more people on there.
Wonderful. Sounds good. I'll add those links in the description. But thank you so much for taking the time.
Of course, yeah. Thanks, Sam. It's
Wonderful.
fun.
All right.